You might be forgiven for thinking that there was no news in this part of the world apart from gazing admiringly at the Messiah that has just emerged as the new man to lead the world, and that is, of course, Joe Biden. Peter Hitchens, of course, has more important things to think about. He joins me now. Peter, very good morning. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, you wanted to speak about all of the things that are going on with our current lockdown, which we will do. But I'd also like to ask you about Remembrance Sunday. I watched it yesterday. It was, also one of those events that I always enjoy watching on television. I've never actually been to the cenotaph to witness it, but an awful lot of people would have liked to have gone and weren't allowed to.
Can you hear me now?
It's a little bit quiet. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
No, it's not quite.
Can you hear me now?
That's it. Yes, there you are. That is.
Okay, there we are then.
There we are. Yes. So let me just ask you that again. Remembrance Sunday. I don't know whether you were able to watch it on television. It was good that it took place, but it was a disappointment for a lot of people who wanted to go and who wanted to celebrate and remember their fallen colleagues.
I mean, as always, it's moving because of what it is, but there was something highly peculiar about the sight of people standing these rather ridiculous distances from each other. And of course, many actual events, one of which I had hoped to attend, didn't take place.
Right.
The small church which I attend most weeks and which holds the remembrance service by the local village war memorial had first of all said they were going to move it to a cemetery so we could all stand a long way from each other, though we wouldn't be allowed to sing, presumably because singing is so dangerous, and then it was cancelled. So I wasn't able to do that. I much prefer these small events. I find them more powerful and more evocative, and having to actually stand outside in the cold for 2 minutes and open your mind to recollections of what that war must have been like seemed to me to be important, but I couldn't do it. So as a day, it was another day during which the calendar was all wrong.
No, I couldn't agree more.
It had gone missing. The normal life had gone missing again. And in my view, completely unjustifiably, and I think that the churches made a terrible mistake by taking the knee to Mike Hancock in his dubious decrees back in March, and he rewarded them by kicking him in the face, basically.
Yeah. Well, I heard rather disturbingly different stories over the weekend. I heard Olivia Utley, who's the deputy leader writer on The Sun, saying that members of her family, I'm not sure where they are, were going to sort of church secretly, and secret church services were going on, unbeknownst to the authorities, which sounded to me like something out of the most despotic part of the world that you would never have imagined. And then secondly, I heard stories of people who were trying to go to pay their respects at sort of local cenotaphs, as many towns and villages have all around the country, and they were being stopped from getting too close to the monument itself by police.
Well, this is, as you say, the idea of church services in a Christian country being illegal is itself creepy and disturbing.
Really.
And then the idea of police trying to prevent people from going to remembrance services, again, it's reminiscent of some other kind of country, not this one. I never want to exaggerate these things and say we're now living in some kind of Soviet or Nazi dictatorship, because we're obviously not. But we're also not living in Britain, as most of us are brought up to understand and know it.
No, quite. And that is the problem, isn't it? Because aside from all of those restrictions yesterday, I spoke to a veteran, funnily enough, last week, 96-year-old man who had been in the SAS during the Second World War. And he told, as so often these guys do, with complete and utter sort of glib disregard, how he was blown up while driving a Jeep across some part of northern France. The Jeep was completely destroyed. He was hurled over a hedge. He managed to survive it, luckily. But he said he can't go to Westminster because they've told him it's too dangerous.
No, I know.
It's awful, isn't it?
How do we? What people were prepared to do for the continued freedom of this country, compared with what we are not prepared to do, it's heartbreaking in a way. It's almost impossible to square what goes on now with, say, the country that I was brought up to believe that I lived in. But it plainly has disappeared. We don't live there anymore. And I think we now know pretty much what the response of this population will be if there's a serious effort to introduce repression here, greater than the one we have already. Most people will, I think, accept it, and that's where we are. Alas, it is the case.
Yes, and I mean, the question I've been asking this morning, after discovering that last week Merthyr Tydfil became, I think, the most highly infectious place in the United Kingdom, despite the fact that it had been locked down by Mark Drakeford for the last 2 weeks, is how do we know that there has been a success in Wales, because there doesn't appear to be any measure of that. And Mark Drakeford's already starting to make noises about how life could never return to normal.
No, because of the nature of the emotional portrayal of this supposed pandemic, a term I'm very reluctant to use, there's been a presumption in favor of every single belief of those who wanted to shut the country down. It's presumed that lockdowns have an effect. It's presumed that they limit the spread of the disease. It's presumed that masks have an effect in the same way. We get all these presumptions over and over again, and they are unexamined. And it still is the case that if you look at all the countries in the world and look at the ones which have most severely shut down their economies and societies, there's no correlation between the severity and the lowering of the death rate. So why should there be here? And in any case, what are we actually doing? When this began, we were told it would be 3 weeks to save the NHS, to flatten the curve. Nobody had any illusions about somehow suppressing or removing the disease from society. It was just a matter of which you possibly can do, of slowing down the transmission, but that's all. And now we've got this mission creep. So we're sort of happened in Vietnam. So starting off from a small intervention, you end up actually trying for the first time in human history to defeat a virus by state action. It's unheard of, and in my view, wholly impractical. And I really don't grasp how this has happened without more scrutiny.
Yeah, I know. And maybe it's because it has been done as that kind of mission creep, that, as you say, when we all were told back in the end of March that this is something you're going to have to do for the good of Queen and country, and everybody kind of went, oh, okay, then, that seems fair enough.
Well, almost everybody.
Well, almost everybody, as you say. But even those who were reluctant sort of still did it. And I mean, even you yourself, Peter, have said that, you've done things. When we first started these conversations, you said that, if people wanted you to wear a mask, despite the fact that you wouldn't want to normally do that, out of politeness, because you're a polite person, you would do it.
Well, I wrapped a scarf around my face, which is something I've done in cold weather. It's rather different from wearing one of those repulsive muzzles. But basically, my view was, and has been all along, it's as if I were living in a country with a different religion from mine. I'll be respectful without believing in it.
Yes, but I think now
I'm getting less respectful, I have to say, as the days go by.
Yeah, and I think you're not alone, because I've seen, I would say, absolutely no reduction in the numbers of people walking around. I've seen no reduction in the numbers of people going to work. So whatever entreaty that Boris Johnson has said to people, please work from home if you can, nobody's doing it who wasn't already doing it.
Well, my experience is slightly different. I mean, it's certainly my barometer of small business in Oxford was doing very badly yesterday morning.
Yeah,
they're very worried about their future. My journey in this morning, I had pretty much a train to myself. Paddington Station, when I arrived, was almost devoid of human beings, apart from a small number of staff. So I think it is having some effect. And the working from home thing, of course, is especially since we continue to shovel out funny money to pay for it, it continues to be quite appealing to a lot of people. I think some people who had returned to work have now gone back home, and I think it has done and will do damage. Don't underestimate the damage this is doing to businesses which have survived so far, especially at a time of year when they really, really need the pre-Christmas trade, and they're not getting it.
Right. No, I totally don't underestimate that. I've always said to you, I can't quite understand where the money's coming from. It's so large now, the numbers are so ridiculous that it's almost as though it's out of all proportion with reality, and therefore it's not actually real.
Can I advertise here a small piece by Dan Atkinson, a colleague of mine on Mail Online, a really astute economic commentator, which I've tweeted a few times and will continue to do so, about how basically the Bank of England and the Treasury have together magicked 150 billion quid out of nowhere.
Yeah.
It's very dicey stuff. It's the sort of thing that the German Reichsbank tried between 1914 and 1924. When they tried to finance an entire war on the basis of the belief that they would win it, and then they lost it. and then there wasn't any money left to pay. And that was the fundamental reason, in my view, why the German mark collapsed in the 1920s. I think we are certainly on target, not for a collapse of this pound sterling, certainly a very major reduction in its real value in the next few years. It's happening, and it's read Dan Atkinson's piece. It's amazing the magic they use. But I have a feeling if private business did what the government and the Bank of England are doing now, they get into quite serious trouble.
Well, they wouldn't be allowed to, would they? You wouldn't be able to borrow that much money. I mean, the only thing you could say which is similar is in the cases where, not necessarily the banks, I'd rather not use them as an example, but certainly there have been organisations, companies, which were in so much hock to the banks that the banks could not let them fall or fail because they owed them so much money. So it was in their interest to keep them going. Similarly, I wonder, and I don't say this with any assuredness, I wonder whether the world's economies will have to be somehow artificially kept afloat for the rest of time.
Well, maybe they can't be. That's the trouble.
Yeah,
this is the grave worry which we face. Can all this be sustained indefinitely, or will it eventually come back to bite us so hard that we don't really have economies anymore? All our savings are gone. We cease to be independent beings. All the people in society have spent years building up savings, buying their houses and all the rest of it, establishing pensions, suddenly all become wholly dependent on the state, and a state which is much poorer than the one we have now. This is what frightens me.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, again, we had a call last week from a very pleasant woman from, I think it was Droitwich, who runs a stationery shop in a shopping centre, who was told by the police who visited her that she had to close her shop or face a £200 fine, despite the fact that 2 doors down in the shopping centre, WH Smith's was allowed to sell exactly what she sold, but it was necessary and essential because they also sold sandwiches and newspapers.
Yeah, these rules are ridiculous. The thing is, you can actually, this is one of the reasons why the Welsh government got into trouble, but telling supermarkets they couldn't sell things a few weeks ago, because I think what they were trying to do, and I don't want to be too unfair to them, was to protect the small shops from competition from bigger shops which were not restricted. And once you start shutting down shops, this kind of thing arises. The simplest way of avoiding it is don't shut down shops in the first place.
Right.
Don't shut down employment. Don't strangle their own economy. But trying to get anybody to understand that strangling your economy is wildly disproportionate response to a disease which, as I keep saying, while unpleasant, simply isn't serious enough to justify this, remains the biggest struggle of our time. Why are we doing this?
Well,
why can't we bring it to an end? There's a madness abroad, which people are incredibly willing to accept unexamined. And I do think the whole role of facts and reason in our society has diminished almost to a speck. Hardly anybody seems to be interested in either.
But isn't it interesting as well that when they do have an element of opportunity in Parliament to scrutinise what's going on, there was only something like, 38 Tory MPs who voted against. Now, given that the even if you believe the YouGov surveys that say that 2/3 of the country want a lockdown, you've got a third of the country which is not represented by 38 people, I'm afraid, inside a place where they have hundreds and hundreds of MPs. Why so few of them willing to stand out here?
Because they're afraid of the government party, of the whips who keep them in order, and they need to be more afraid. And I'll say this again, and people should be doing it now. They should be doing it all the time. Don't try to reason with your member of parliament. Most of them are boobies who can't reason and wouldn't understand. And don't worry about the stupid replies which you'll get, which will be printed off from some website. Just carry on writing to them very briefly. Don't waste any time. Be brief, be polite, but be acid, and say this over and over again. If you continue to put people out of work and destroy their businesses, why should you expect still to be in work yourself after the next election? And this will have an effect if enough people do it. Honestly, demonstrations are useless and a waste of time. I'm not going to advocate any kind of civil disobedience or breaking the law, but if enough people will just write to their members of parliament and say to them, look, unless you stop this, you've lost my vote forever. You will lose your job. There is no such thing as a safe seat. Look at what happened to Labour in Scotland, where they all thought they were safe. There is no such thing as, when people understand what this absurd strangling of the economy has done to their lives, their livelihood, their children's futures, the health service, everything they value about our society, when that sinks in, there will not be a single member of parliament whose seat is safe unless they now stand up and say, we've had enough of this. And the only way this will get through is not by the eloquence of your argument, It's by the number of people emailing to say this over and over and over again. So the next time this comes up, they vote against it in such numbers that the government has to give in or fall. And it's the only way you'll get anywhere. And I keep on saying it, it's within your power. And there's a website called writetothem.com where you can get the details of all of the email addresses of your MP. Write to him or her now and keep doing it. Get your friends and neighbors to do it. Get your work colleagues to do it. Get passers-by in the street to do it. Don't waste time reasoning. Just say, if you won't help keep other people in a job, why should you keep yours?
And I think more than ever, Peter, it's worth doing, because this is clearly a government that reacts to public opinion. You know, it uses data. The Sunday Times did a piece some months back saying that basically the sort of the political unit inside of Number 10 is absolutely obsessed with data. You know, Dominic Cummings, obsessed with data. So if the data actually shows that people are unhappy, they will react, as indeed they did at the weekend over free school meals.
Yeah, and they spend, I suppose, in a way, freedom from the COVID madness needs its own Marcus Rashford. If there are any footballers out there who want to start a fight on this, then please let's find out who they are and get them involved. But Downing Street spends huge quantities of money and effort on propaganda, and if that propaganda starts to fail, then they will give in. But this is the way to do it. So what people foolishly imagine is that they can, by eloquence and long disquisitions, they can persuade their MPs. That's not the point. The point is MPs must see thousands of emails in their inbox saying, stop doing this or you're sacked.
Yeah.
That's what MPs must see. Stop doing this or you're sacked, mate.
Yeah.
And then they will change their minds, because they need to be more afraid of the voters than they are of the government whips.
Yes.
Or the opposition whips in the case of the Labour Party, which is also determined to fling all its voters on the dole.
Yeah, because there does surely at some point or other, I mean, we're told that, you know, this whole lockdown for 4 weeks is going to be so that Christmas can be relatively normal. I don't really believe that, and I'm sure you don't either. No. And I'm sure that they will continue, if they were to make Christmas somehow, you know, lockdown free, they'd bring another one in January, because they don't seem to yet get the idea that people are not buying it anymore.
Well, too many people still are buying it, and that's another problem. People buy it because the government appears still to be confident, because the dissenting scientists such as Sunetra Gupta are still not getting a fair crack of the whip from the broadcasting organisations, because not enough of the newspapers are actually paying attention to the needs and desires of their readers, and are still carrying on urging their readers to support national bankruptcy and the destruction of the NHS, which is what's visibly going on. And more it comes out, the collateral damage from this. And Sunetra Gupta has now set up a website on collateral damage. The collateral damage of this to cancer patients, heart patients, huge numbers of other people who needed treatment and need it now, is colossal. And almost certainly at the end of this, when the accounting is finally done, the grim accounting of life and death, it will turn out that more people have died because of the government's reaction to the coronavirus than have died from the coronavirus itself.
And let me ask you this as a final question, just slightly off to the side. I mean, I was staggered at the weekend, given that we are where we are with coronavirus, that we are in the midst of a pandemic sort of overreaction, perhaps, or whatever you may feel that it is, in a lockdown. And yet we're getting wall-to-wall sort of minutiae coverage of how they were voting in Allegheny County, how great Joe Biden is, how brilliant that he's now won the presidency, which he hasn't actually won yet. I mean, when did we become quite so craven as a media to this?
I've no idea. I mean, my view of the United States is that it is a foreign country.
Yeah.
I lived there and found just how foreign it was, that it's not by any means necessarily a country friendly to us. I've just reposted on my blog and on a number of other places articles I've written in a BBC Radio 4 program I made when I was still allowed to do that, on how the special relationship is a laughable myth.
Yeah.
It's not true. It's partly, I suppose, because journalists love going to the United States on somebody else's money, and it's a great trip. They're becoming much of a trip now, with everyone being forced to wear muzzles and not being allowed to travel and all the rest of it. But nonetheless, it seems to me to be grossly overcovered.
Yeah.
In British media, and of course the BBC does this at Olympic levels, as it always has. I was cured really of interest in American politics at that level by being very, very close to it in Washington, D.C. for 2 years. It doesn't really bother me very much who is president of the United States. Let's be frank. In 1776, they declared independence, and they're jolly well entitled to it, and let them have it, and we'll leave them to it. Honestly, I could do with more coverage of some other equally interesting countries of which we hear very little and which we don't get. Particularly, I'd like to hear an awful lot more about China and the hideous way in which that country is governed, rather than going on and on about the United States.
Yes, I think that would be a far better use of taxpayers' money and licence payers' money as well. Peter, thank you very much, as ever. Peter Hitchens there, reporting in to us. Once again, every week we get Peter on a Monday to discuss what's going on. He seems less, I would say, encouraged than ever by what the political leaders of this country are doing, and he does urge you to write to your MP, which you should do, to at least engage with them and make them realise that you pay their salaries, that you pay their expenses, that they work for you, and you are entitled to express your view of what they are doing. And if you think they're doing something wrong, then you should tell them so. It's as simple as that.